This story is about a mother-in-law who always seemed on the verge of death due to her pretended illness, and how a certain event miraculously cured her. What could have happened? Let's find out together. Please subscribe and like our channel.
Hello. I'm a woman in my early 40s with 2 children. It's really hard to work and take care of the kids at the same time. Things have gotten easier now that the kids are older and need less attention. I sometimes miss the chaotic times when I was busier. There are times when I miss their baby days, when they were just adorable. It was hard to work and raise 2 kids, but it was even harder because of my in-laws. I had been dating my husband for 4 years before we got married, and I had a lot of concerns during the process. I was in my late 20s at that time, and my husband was in his early 30s. I didn't have much thought about marriage. I had a vague idea that if I were to get married, it would have to be with this person. My in-laws were in a hurry for us to get married. Since I was considering marrying him, I started preparing for the wedding. At first, there was excitement about getting married. There was also fear about establishing an independent household, away from my parents. Things were complicated enough, and they got even more complicated because of my mother-in-law. I started worrying more because of my mother-in-law, and the idea of marriage itself started to scare me. My husband has always been a diligent person, from when I first met him until now. When I saw him before we got married, he seemed to be a responsible man who would make a good husband. My friends who knew my husband said he would make a good husband. We saw each other's flaws during the 4 years we dated, but I think we got along well because he had many more strengths. My mother-in-law was always a sick person before we got married. She was physically and emotionally sick. After meeting me a few times, my mother-in-law said, "I've been crying every day thinking about him getting married." She was depressed thinking about her son moving out after getting married. She said she seemed to be depressed and that she should go to the hospital. But I didn't know what to say. If she was so depressed about her son moving out, did that mean I made her depressed as the spouse of her son? Why would she say such a thing? I was so confused that I told my husband how I felt, but he just said that's how all parents feel when they're getting their son married. No matter how much I told him that my mother-in-law's words bothered me, he just told me not to worry about it. Was she depressed because she was getting her only son married after having 2 daughters? Even if I tried to understand her in this way, I couldn't understand why she kept saying she was depressed in front of me. She wasn't the type of person to rely on her son that much. The atmosphere in my in-laws' house was a bit different from my parents' house, and my in-laws were not that close to their children. My sisters-in-law still find their mother bothersome, and it wasn't like she had a close relationship with her son. After getting married, I had some friction with my sisters-in-law. They insisted that I call my mother-in-law frequently. I said okay, but I didn't call her more often. Whenever I called, she would always say she was sick, and no matter how much she was my mother-in-law, I didn't want to call her. Whenever we talked on the phone, she would always say she was depressed. She would say that none of her 3 children understood her feelings, and that she didn't need anything, always with a voice that sounded like she was dying. But I later found out that the reason my sisters-in-law were insisting that I call was because of my mother-in-law. Every day, my mother-in-law would call my sisters-in-law and complain, "My daughter-in-law never calls me, she never visits our house." She expressed her feelings of being upset with me. I had a fairly neutral relationship with my sisters-in-law. There was no reason to fall out with people. I hardly ever saw more than a few times a year. Later, my sisters-in-law told me, "You know how our mother is. But she keeps calling and saying such things, and it makes us think badly of you." When my sisters-in-law called me and said I should call my mother-in-law more often, visit her more often, and treat her better. I did get angry, but I also understood. How badly did my mother-in-law talk about me when she called her daughters? I also wondered. I didn't neglect to call my mother-in-law frequently. Isn't calling your mother-in-law 2 or 3 times a week often enough? When I had my first child, my mother-in-law would come almost every day and nag at me before leaving. She said she was coming to our house every day to help me. But when she actually came, she did not help with anything, and just nagged about this and that before leaving. Did she really want to vent her frustrations to her daughter-in-law, who was struggling with a newborn and lack of sleep? She was always depressed, saying she felt like dying, that she had no energy and was going insane, and that there was no part of her body that wasn't in pain. When I had my second child, I told my husband to ask his mother not to come. Then I was shocked to hear her say, "Why are you asking me not to come? I was going to help, just like I did when you had your first child." As my children grew up, my mother-in-law became even sicker. She always claimed that she had no appetite and didn't eat. I wonder how she maintains her size for someone who doesn't eat that much. She has no appetite and no energy to cook. So she would ask me to buy this and that on my way home from work. Did she really want to ask her daughter-in-law, who is tired from working and picking up the child from daycare, to do such things? When my husband bought her things, she would get depressed again, saying she made her busy son run errands. My mother-in-law refused to go to the hospital. She didn't mention anything about the results of her comprehensive medical checkup. So I guess there was nothing wrong with her body. My mother-in-law always says she is sick because she suffered a lot when she was young. But she didn't really suffer much. I thought she was a person who suffered a lot when I didn't know her very well. But she lived a life that was so comfortable that it would be rare to find someone who lived as comfortably as she did. She lived on the money her husband earned. I know that there were many mothers in my parents' generation who worked while raising children. My mother has been working since I was young. When the children grew a bit and required less attention, my mother-in-law started asking me to come to her house every weekend to prepare meals and do house chores. She claimed that she was mentally and physically exhausted and didn't have the energy to cook. My father-in-law did the cleaning and laundry, but he was clumsy and it wasn't satisfactory. And my father-in-law didn't know how to cook. So as a daughter-in-law, I had to do it. When I talked to my husband about it, he said it didn't make sense and called my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, who had never said a word to me, suddenly declared that she would start speaking up because I was living without knowing my duty as a daughter-in-law. When we asked her what we had done wrong, she burst into tears and yelled that her son was only siding with his wife. Unable to forgive her children for neglecting their sick mother, she demanded that all her children come to her house on the weekend. My younger sister-in-law, who detests her mother, didn't show up that day. Only my elder sister-in-law and I ended up going. My mother-in-law sobbed, accusing no one of caring for their sick mother. She said, "I suffered so much to raise you, and you don't even appreciate it. Your duty as a daughter-in-law is to come over on weekends, do some work, and then leave. But you're refusing to do even that, and I feel so wronged." At this point, my sister-in-law got angry. She retorted, "What hardships did you go through, Mom? You've lived a life of leisure. We're the ones who work and raise kids. You should be grateful to Dad all your life." This made my mother-in-law weep even more. My father-in-law told us that there was no need for us to stay, and that we should go home. We didn't want to stay there and listen to my mother-in-law's strange complaints anyway. So when my father-in-law told us to leave, we went back home. A few days later, we heard surprising news. My father-in-law had proposed a divorce to my mother-in-law. He suggested selling the house, splitting the money, and getting a divorce. After a while, he moved out to a rented room. He said, "I've put up with your mother so far, but I can't take it anymore." Normally, when elderly parents talk about divorce, their children try to dissuade them. But my husband and his sisters had no intention of doing so. My mother-in-law called her children and asked them to talk to their father, but they all said that it was a problem she had caused herself. When my mother-in-law asked me over the phone to talk to my father-in-law, I said, "Isn't it more comfortable for you to get divorced? You've been having a hard time preparing meals for him with your sick body. And now you don't have to do that anymore. Isn't that much more comfortable? Just get divorced. It's an opportunity to finally leave your husband who has made you suffer. What's there to hesitate about?" My mother-in-law couldn't say a word. After about 2 years of separation, my father-in-law moved back in. My mother-in-law promised to change, and the children persuaded him to return. After this incident, my mother-in-law's illness miraculously disappeared. My father-in-law set a condition when he moved back in. If she claimed to be sick without any illness, he would file for divorce immediately. Looking back, I realize how hard it must have been for my father-in-law and my husband and his brothers. It must have been really tiresome for them to live with a wife and mother who claimed to be dying every day.
There are people who constantly complain about being sick even though they are healthier than anyone else. Why do they do that? They seem unaware that their behavior is making the people around them sick.